Hello, greetings of the day. I'm Shalini Jha, and today I will be interviewing former Ambassador Kelley Currie on behalf of Red Lantern Analytica. Before I go on to formally introduce our esteemed guest here, let me give you a brief overview of the interview and tell you a little bit about Red Lantern Analytica. Red Lantern Analytica is an international affairs observer group working out of New Delhi, India, which researches upon critical issues related to international foreign policy of India and particularly focusing on Sino-India relations. And today's interview will revolve around understanding the role of the US Department of State in addressing global women's issues, discussions around the geopolitical issues at hand, particularly related to China, and finally discussing about the way forward with regards to women's issues and the future of feminist geopolitics. Um, and our guest over here is, of course, Mrs. Kelley Currie served as the US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues and the US Representative at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. Prior to that, she led the Department of State's Office of Global Criminal Justice, and as the United States representatives to the UN Economic and Social Council and alternative representative to the UN General Assembly. Throughout her career in foreign policy, former Ambassador Currie has specialized in human rights, political reform, development, and humanitarian issues, with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. She has held senior policy positions with the Department of State, the US Congress, and several international and non-governmental human rights and humanitarian organizations. Over to you, ma'am, for introductory remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Shalini. It's my honor to be with you today and to be on the Red Lantern Analytica platform and to be able to engage with you about an issue that is very close to my heart, which is the situation of women in the world and how we can advance the rights and roles of women through foreign policy and national security policy, and give women the voice that they deserve in security policy issues, as well as you're on two of my favorite issues, which is also the issue of the rise of China and what that means not just for women, but for all of us, especially for those of us in democratic countries, and what it means to have an authoritarian rising power like China seeking to assert itself in a whole host of ways that are not good for democratic self-governance in our own countries, as well as in countries that are struggling to establish deeper roots in their own democracies. And in the Asia Pacific region in particular, this has been a real struggle. And then you also see this twilight struggle going on between authoritarianism and democracy, and you see the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is committing gross human rights violations inside China, violating the rights of its own people with impunity, including and especially these days the genocidal policies against the Uyghurs and other Muslim Turkic minority peoples in Western China, as well as the plight of the Tibetans and other minority groups, and the whole situation of how China rules at home and how that relates to how they engage the world is something that I have long been fascinated by and studied throughout my career. So I'm excited to dive in. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it.
Absolutely. I'm so looking forward to the conversation as well, and we will obviously touch upon the key issues that you just mentioned about. So my first question to you is, what are the key priorities of the US Department of State, and particularly the Office of the Ambassador at Large, with regards to addressing global women's issues? And as the former ambassador, have you noted any shifts in the order of these priorities as a consequence of the pandemic?
Well, definitely last year when I was the ambassador at large, I started out with two main priorities in January of 2020, with primarily working on women, peace, and security, which was a very important agenda to me personally, having worked on it in the Security Council and seen the consequences of it, of the lack of engagement on women, peace, and security, how it tends to foster environments for mass atrocities, sexual violence, armed conflict, and all sorts of things that harm women and families and girls take place when women aren't actively involved in peace and security issues. So that was a big priority for me. And also for the office, we had just, the United States had just passed a law in 2017, signed into law something called the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which made the United States the first country in the world to have formal national level legislation implementing the tenets of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. So we had a lot of work on our plate around the women, peace, and security agenda. And we were also launching a major women's economic empowerment initiative that had been underway for a couple of years to really try to refocus. We had a lot of initiatives that had been developed over the years. You know, this is an issue that the United States has been very involved in, whether it's women in development or women and girls education and women's health. And so the idea that we needed to really focus on women, especially women as entrepreneurs, because if you look across, especially not, you know, in the United States as well as in the developing world, women are heavily weighted towards entrepreneurial opportunities because it's frankly the barriers to entry generally are lower for them, and they can manage their work-life balance a little easier as entrepreneurs. And often it's the only channel economically available to them. If you think about women in the marketplace selling fruits and vegetables or selling products that they've made or produced, those women are entrepreneurs, even if they're not being called that in local economies. So we really wanted to help women with to develop as entrepreneurs, to move up the value chain, to have greater skills and opportunities. And when the pandemic hit, we were getting ready to really scale up some of these economic initiatives. And it really caused us to have to take a pause and say, is this the right thing to be doing? Women are, and then we saw very quickly that women were among the first to be laid off from their jobs. They were heavily in the service industries and in industries that required them to be present and physically present in their positions. They were suffering disproportionately from shutdowns of markets. And so we saw that the pandemic very early on was having this disproportionate impact on women. They were also seeing additions to their unpaid care burdens, which is a big issue for women, especially women with families. And so we were really conscious of the need to make sure that the women's economic empowerment work that we were doing was very keyed to the challenges that were emerging as a result of the pandemic. It proved to be a great opportunity to engage with a lot of partners around the world, especially in developing countries, about how they needed to remove barriers to women's participation, because it's really it in a country like the United States, where we are dealing with where women's barriers to participation tend to be not laws or policies, but more things like how we deal with the burden of unpaid care, or access to credit and things like that. There's no law that says women can't get a loan. It's just historical patterns that women don't always ask for more money than men. There are studies that show that when men go in to ask for a loan, they ask for more than what they need, whereas women are very conservative and they will only ask for the smallest amount that they think that they need, because they don't want to get overextended. So there were a lot of things like that here in the United States that we're dealing with, but in other countries, there were actual legal prohibitions on a woman being able to get a loan by herself, or, or being able to use her business as collateral unless her husband signed on, or a male relative signed on to the loan. So getting rid of things like that were holding women back seemed like some what we call low hanging fruit. And so we were focused on working with partners who were like, look, it's not going to cost you $1 billion. We're not talking about adding a massive new child care entitlement. We're saying change your law. It doesn't cost you a dime, but it will make it easier for women to be able to participate in the economy. And right now, the last thing you need is things that are holding back women from being able to participate in the economy. As we try to rebuild economically from the pandemic, it's going to continue to be important. So those were the kinds of things that we focused on. And it was a really big couple of agendas. Within those agendas, we were also focused on a lot of the traditional issues as well. Cross-cutting issues like violence against women and gender-based violence, and some of the other human rights abuses that we saw as challenging. And that's where the work that we were doing on China came in, as we saw that, especially the situation in Xinjiang with women there, facing a really serious plight from what was happening. While the majority of the detainees were male, we saw what was happening in the family with women, and how the human rights abuses were stressing the family. And women are often the carriers of culture, and they are the ones who transmit the culture, and being disconnected from their children, losing their spouses, losing their family cohesion, it was causing huge stress. And then we also started to learn more about the sexual and gender-based violence inside the detention camps, as well as last year, the news about the forced sterilization and forced abortion also came out. So it gave us a lot of reason to be very concerned and to focus on that issue as well.
Right. In fact, picking on the points you just mentioned about, you have, even right now, you mentioned about it, and you have personally been committed to advocating human rights, and you've always taken a strong stand when it comes to the reported atrocities against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And you made a statement a few months earlier about the complete lack of curiosity or concern we see from the UN on what are quite disturbing human rights abuses. Could you please elaborate more on that?
Sure. One of the things that we've struggled with, and this goes back to my time when I was in New York working for Ambassador Haley, and Ambassador Haley and I, in 2017, started to, we were being briefed about the situation as it was starting to unfold, and we would go in and talk to the UN and talk to UN bodies and try to raise these issues, and we were met with indifference. It was really striking. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was not really interested in pursuing these issues. Actually, that's not true. At the staff level, they were interested and they were very concerned about it. But at the leadership level, they were like, no, thank you. We're busy with other things. And we're like, okay, this is really concerning. And then we continued to push it. We saw that the Chinese government, the PRC government, was very aggressive in trying to shut down the conversation in the UN. And a very specific example of this was when there was the head of the World Uyghur Congress, Dulkin Issa, tried to participate in a forum in New York, the People's Forum on Indigenous Issues. And he was denied entry into the UN, even though the Chinese officials accused him of being a terrorist. And we had to take this all the way up to the Secretary General. And the Secretary General did not want to deal with it. He kept trying to say, oh, it's the security office. You just need to talk to the security office. But they're like, yeah, we actually need the Secretary General. The security office was like, we're not going to do anything unless the Secretary General tells us it's okay. And so we were caught in this ridiculous loop where he just was avoiding responsibility. It was really shocking to me, frankly, because I had seen him working on refugee issues for many years and thought of him as a real fighter for people who were suffering. And to see him just completely abdicate responsibility on these issues was really disturbing. So we started doing more speaking out about it in New York, raising it in every appropriate forum, and in Geneva as well. And as long as we were on the Human Rights Council, we raised it. And then even after we left the Human Rights Council, we continued to raise these issues. I participated in a event, and we had very positive responses on this issue, and continue to see leadership from the special procedures, the appointed experts who are independent and are able to do independent reporting. But the Office of the High Commissioner has been completely absent. Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner herself, has said that she would like to go and visit Xinjiang, but she has not pushed very hard for access. And they are just now, there was a report that was done by, again, after being pushed a lot by member states to do it, and then never released. Because the Chinese were very upset about it. And we see that in the past, the Office of the High Commissioner has shared names of people who were coming to Geneva to talk about human rights in China with the Chinese government, and that has allowed the Chinese government to threaten these individuals, detain them, harass their families if they are living in exile, or do the thing that they did with Dolganiso, which was to try to block him from even participating. So we continue to, during my time in office, we continue to try to push the UN to do more, and they just aren't interested in doing it, was my experience.
It is indeed an alarming state of affairs, to be very honest. And since you talked about UN and even the growing role of China in UN is causing a lot of concerns, and a lot of reports are coming in on that. 15 UN specialized agencies are headed by Chinese nationals. And there were several reports, one of which I would quote, which says that global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown, and also in the wake of the coronavirus outbreak. And there are a number of alternative global institutions, excuse me, as well as alliances between democratic countries to counter China's regressive and expansionist policies, like the IPAC, Quad, or D10. How do you judge this position of the rest of the international community with regards to China? Is it a good sign?
Well, I think we've seen movement, certainly, but it continues to be a challenge. I look at Europe in particular as trying to have it both ways, and thinking that they can continue to just trade and do business and have economic engagement with China, or try to do some kind of balance between. My friend Matt Pottinger refers to it as trying to have a foot in two boats. And that if you've ever tried to do that, then it's not a very stable situation, and usually you end up in the water when you try to do that. So I think that that's a good analogy for what you still see a lot of countries doing. I've seen tremendous movement from we don't want to talk about it position to, okay, we'll have a conversation about it, but we still want to keep our options open. So there's been movement for sure. And the window what we call the Overton window has moved on China, I think. But I think that there's still, and in the United States, we're still dealing with this, and I think in India as well, that we are so intertwined economically and in so many ways with China today, that it's creating a lot of challenges for us. And I look at things like what's happened in the past few weeks with Xinjiang cotton, where you have all of these companies that last year had issued statements when the reports on forced labor and cotton came out, and when the United States put some restrictions on cotton, and they came out and said, we don't have Xinjiang cotton in our supply chain, we're working really hard to keep it out, and we're investigating, and we're going to take a stand here. But then in the past couple weeks, when the Europeans and others moved to put similar sanctions on forced labor, around forced labor and cotton, the Chinese kind of freaked out and started lashing out at everybody about it. And then they launched this weird campaign, this like pro Xinjiang cotton campaign, where they had all their Chinese influencers I love Xinjiang cotton, it's the best, kind of weird stuff on Weibo. And then you also had all these companies being threatened and facing a backlash for their anti-forced labor stand. And it just is so like mental. It's just like, how do so you're seeing these companies that have also been trying to keep a foot in two boats. It's not tenable anymore. And I like the story about how, in the United States, Starbucks, the coffee company, they're a social justice enterprise that sells coffee in many ways. They take a lot of social stands. They are very much talking about the environment and about, paying a fair price for coffee to their growers. If you go in a Starbucks, it's all about, these are our growers, we take care of them, and they give full health benefits, and they do a lot of political advocacy on social issues in the United States. In China, Starbucks is a company that sells coffee, period, full stop. They don't get involved in anything, maybe the environment, because that's okay, but only in ways that are really, really safe and not, wouldn't be, talking about the fact that you can't see 2 feet in front of your face in Beijing on a winter day. Like, they wouldn't talk about that ever, but they'll talk about like some soft stuff. But otherwise, they're just a coffee company, and they'll tell you, oh, in China we just sell coffee, we don't get involved in their human rights abuses. Never. No, we would not do that. So but it's creating a tension in our globalized world where you just can't get away with that. You can't be a social justice warrior in the United States and then ignore mass atrocities in China with your business model. It's becoming untenable, and it's for companies and for countries alike.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would like to put a pin on that and come back to it later and talk more about the US foreign policy and the US-China relations and how they've been affected. But I want to get back to what we were discussing at the start of the conversation regarding how pandemic has affected women and other vulnerable groups. The pandemic has also posed a lot of challenges when it comes to acting in favor of these vulnerable population. And one such has also been listed in the recent advocacy brief on gender released by the WHO, which says that there is limited availability of sex and age disaggregated data, which hampers the analysis of gendered complications of COVID-19. So can you tell me, according to you, what are the major challenges, besides the obvious, that have been a result of the pandemic and that have kind of hindered the work of the US Department of State in solving global women's issues? And how are some of these challenges tackled? Could you please comment on that?
Well, I think, again, you've hit on one of the key issues. It's hard to have good policies if you don't have good data and don't really know what's going on. And so one of the areas that we were very focused on, and we found this even within our own government. In fact, there was recently a Government Accountability Office study that looked at a bunch of USAID programs that were meant to assist women with economic, with economic empowerment, and they go back decades. Many of these programs, but that even USAID didn't have good data on beneficiaries, and so this was something that we started to work on. But these are really difficult problems, right? Women, and then with the pandemic, making them harder, because if you think about how you're going to collect data, you're going to do it. You normally, in order to access women, you're going to have to go out to where they are. You have to physically, go out and count them and talk to them. You can't always reach them on the phone. Women are less likely to be able they're less likely to have a cell phone. If there's a cell phone in the family, the man usually has it. So there are all sorts of challenges, like physical challenges around data collection, especially in developing countries, but even in the United States, it's still that you have, whether it's pollsters or the census or any data collection effort, you have to make a real effort. And I think even if you look at, for instance, what's going on with the Johnson and Johnson vaccine and this risk of clotting with that, and it was kind of like after the fact, everybody's like, you know what else has they looked at the cohort of the age group and the gender that was having all the clotting problems. It's women of childbearing ages who also tend to be on birth control pills, which also cause clotting. So it's like, but nobody really put that together during the testing phase and during and it didn't really become clear until you had these massive numbers of people taking it and you could start to see it. So that shows one of the downside risks if you're not very consciously thinking about these things at the project design level. And so one of the things that we really worked on, and again, these are long-term changes that have to be made at the country level, and within our own programming, about how you make sure you're getting, like, we really, even on our own data with COVID, we had to say when we launched the Paycheck Protection Program, for instance, out of the Small Business Administration, and and so I wanted to talk about that one day, and so I called the White House. I'm like, our intergovernmental affairs. I'm like, can you tell me what the numbers are for the breakdown? And they're like, oh, we don't have that. I'm like, well, you need to tell SBA that they need to get it. They need to be doing gender disaggregated data collection on all of our initiatives. And they're like, oh, you're right, you're right. So, we're like, even ourselves, like, we don't always do it automatically. And so that's the key, is to just get it to be automatic. Like, it's just built in at the project design phase instead of like added on after the fact, which is where it often takes place. So that's one of the things that we really worked on, but it's a whole mind shift. It really takes a long, and you would think that 20 years after the passage of things like the Women, Peace, and Security Resolution and the Security Council, that a lot of the stuff would be automatic by now, but it's not. And it's, but we're working on it. And I think that's the key, is to just be really dedicated to continually having people there who are tapping on the shoulder going, you need to pay attention to these things, and you need to include this data in your project, and you need to make sure that we're looking at and taking into account things like the fact that women don't have cell phones at the same rate as men, and that if you can't go out and physically access them because of the pandemic, you're going to have skewed numbers and you're not going to capture the full picture, and that you're then going to make decisions based on bad information. So it's just a lot of kind of reminding and being a little bit of a pest about it over and over again.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned some really interesting learnings, not only at the national level, but also for grassroots organizations and the small initiatives even we are doing in tier 3, tier 4 cities over here in India. And since I mentioned that we would put a pin on the US-China relations and come back to it later, I think this is the time, since we were talking about it, and what the impact of the foreign policy of the US is on US-China relations. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, mentioned that the current administration's approach is to, quote unquote, put less focus on trying to slow China down and more emphasis on trying to run faster ourselves through increased government investment on research and technologies. What is your take on this foreign policy vis-a-vis that of the previous administration?
Well, I don't think it's ever that binary. I think that, one of the things that we had to confront when we came into office was that people were just asleep to the threat. Like, it really was not perceived as China was not perceived as the threat that it is today. And there was this whole issue around threat perception that was a huge change, and it required a lot of minds resetting of everybody's expectations, resetting of a lot of thinking around how we did everything, and building a lot of stuff up from scratch that had been allowed to not happen or had been allowed to deteriorate over time. And I'm thinking about things like, how we tell our story, how we get our message out, how we talk about the importance of different issues. that things that we took for granted that we couldn't take for granted anymore, and that we had to really sit down and take a hard look at, what are the benefits and the consequences of allowing 300,000 Chinese students to come into the United States every year and study at our top universities and our top research institutions, only primarily in the hard sciences. Like, is there something that is there a risk here? And people hadn't really analyzed the risk at the senior level. And, there was a lot of work being done outside of government on it, and I'm proud to say we were part of some of that. But so I think that, there was a lot of work that had to be done to kind of reset the table. And so I think that it is important, absolutely important, to address some of the issues that we are facing here in the United States. That's got to be our first responsibility, is to meet the needs of our own people and to protect our own people. And when we look at things like the hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing, the incentives that have been created for companies to offshore to China, the financial the unlevel playing field for companies that list on the US stock exchange, for instance, that Chinese companies don't have to meet the same fiduciary and fiscal requirements that US companies do for auditing and transparency. And that's a huge disadvantage to US companies. So there's a whole host of things that have to be kind of addressed, and getting the sequencing right on those is the challenge. Figuring out where to put scarce resources is always the challenge. I feel that we faced a big effort to reset that table. I think that there were a lot of things that we could have done if we hadn't been hit, for instance, by a pandemic last year. It may have changed the way that we were able to address some of these issues. But I think that overall, I worked with a lot of people who were deeply thoughtful about these issues, who worked to prioritize the things that we needed to do from a national security and economic security standpoint, and to try to harden our defenses a little bit. I feel like that's really where we were focused, is, that we needed to build up our own defenses, and less on, it wasn't so much about trying to slow China down, although there was an effort to try to stop them from taking advantage of our open society and taking advantage of the openness and our investments in research and development and things like that. We did not want them to be able to continue to draft off of those things for certain. But that's more about, I feel like that was more defensive than anything else. I feel like we were really working on building up our own defenses. And I think that actually is a continuity. And once you get to that point where you do have those defenses sufficiently, and we're still not there. I mean, we still have a lot of challenges that we're still trying to work through on that. And I just touched on a few of them. But we've made substantial progress there. That's going to have to continue. At the same time, yes, we should be leaning into where we have some advantages as well, our innate strengths, which include things like our principles, our values, and our openness. And I think someone said that, we have to be the best version of ourselves in order to compete with China. And I think that's right. I absolutely agree with that we're not going to win any competition by acting in ways that aren't reflecting that best version of America.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I think you made a very important point there about continuity and not really about binary. And I think it ties everything together. Now, you have worked as a senior fellow with the Project 2049 Institute, where you have been vocal about Tibet and the Tibetan independence movement. And the Tibetan Support and Policy Act of 2020, passed by the US Congress, has been a landmark victory for the people of Tibet, and as it acknowledges the struggle of 6 million Tibetans suffering inside Tibet. Do you see or foresee any effect on Chinese policies in the light of this? And of course, other factors playing along about the international alliances of democratic nations, etc. Do you see any effect on Chinese policies in this light?
Well, in 2004, the Congress passed something called the Tibet Policy Act. That set the stage for a whole range of initiatives that were really, I think, important in helping to institutionalize Tibet policy into U.S. foreign policy and allow the state and give the State Department certain tools. The more recent legislation, whether it's the Reciprocity Act that passed a few years ago, or the legislation that passed last year, these tools this legislation just gives us more tools to help try to advance the rights of the Tibetan people. And I think the United States policy has always been to support the legitimate aspirations of the Tibetan people, whether that ends up being for for genuine autonomy, which is what the Dalai Lama has advocated, or whatever. That we believe that the first responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is to treat the Tibetan people with respect and dignity, to allow them to practice their religious faith and their cultural practices as they see fit, to not to speak their own language, to control the resources to a degree within Tibet, and to benefit from the exploitation of those resources in meaningful ways, to have a voice in how those resources are accessed, and to also be able to maintain the historic ties that transcend the territory of that transcend Tibetan territory, that through Tibetan Buddhism, which, as you know, is practiced in Bhutan, in Mongolia, and in parts of India and Nepal. So there's a whole range of things that the Chinese could do that don't have anything to do with independence, that would give the Tibetan people a greater degree of control and autonomy within their own cultural sphere, and would an economic sphere as well, and most likely would be satisfactory to the vast majority of the Tibetan people inside Tibet and even outside Tibet. And you saw when there were periods of liberalization in Tibet, that where people from who had left were able to come back, work, open businesses, visit their monasteries, where the exchanges across the plateau were more open. That it didn't create animosity toward the Chinese Communist Party, but what happened was that the Chinese Communist Party felt that they were losing control, and they didn't like that. And if there's one thing that the Chinese Communist Party can't have, it is a loss of control. So that's their greatest fear. And they're very fearful of these connections that the Tibetans have with the outside world, and so they keep trying to break them. And breaking those connections is going to lead to resistance. I think it is important for the United States to use all the tools that we have to support Tibetan culture, to support Tibetan autonomy, to support the people of Tibet, and make it clear that we expect the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government to respect their rights and their dignity and their culture.
Yeah, and besides Tibet, you've also been actively speaking against the ongoing crisis and human rights violation in Myanmar. And you have officially also issued statements about how the Chinese policies have favored or sheltered perpetrators in the neighboring countries. There are also numerous reports of China sheltering kingpins of active insurgent groups in northeast India. Now, there is obviously undeniable evidence of the pervasive violence of all kinds in Myanmar. But at the time of the military coup in February in Myanmar, there were several reports from various think tanks and observer groups around the world about China's involvement in the coup. And what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't think that China supported or actively was involved in the coup at all. I don't think that it's in their interest to see this level of instability in Burma. They do not wish to have, they were China was very happy with the status quo ante, with the arrangement that they had with Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. They were able to carry out their economic engagement in Burma. They had the imprimatur of her approval on their big projects. They weren't getting everything they wanted, but they were getting along pretty well, and things were pretty smooth, and they were also able to maintain their relationship with the military. And they benefited tremendously from taking a completely amoral approach to the Rohingya crisis and refusing to do any and blocking any UN action on that crisis as well. So they're they were good with the way things were before. They So the coup didn't exactly make them happy, and this isn't the first time that the Burmese military has made the Chinese government unhappy. They have a habit of doing that because they're not really they're not a client state. They're not like Cambodia. They're fiercely independent. The military is. So, but the Chinese they are able to look at this situation, and they don't feel constrained by human rights concerns about it. If you look at the response from the United States and other countries, you see a lot of concerns expressed about extrajudicial killings and the attacks on civilians and the brutality of the response and cutting off of the internet. You don't see any concerns issued by China about any of those things. When they want a political resolution, they want everybody to get along, and they want to be able to go back and do business, and that's their main, their concerns are very narrowly self-interested. So it means that in a sense that they can just sit back and see who comes out on top. The problem for them is, though, that non-interference policy that they take is not playing very well with the people on the street in Burma. And to the extent that there continues to be protests on the streets, and there continue to be concerns at that there continues to be active resistance, and as that democratic resistance that's focused on democracy and human rights coalesces with the ethnic grievances against the military into a broader, more unified movement, then that becomes really problematic for both the Tatmadaw and the coup, but also for the Chinese. That it makes their situation again less stable and less sustainable over time. So also they are increasingly, and not just China, but also India, because India is on the Security Council right now. People in Burma are increasingly looking at why the Security Council isn't doing anything, as the numbers of people killed continue to go up, and detentions, and it becomes more and more like a state of martial law beyond the coup. Um, that why hasn't the Security Council done anything? And they look at China and Russia as primarily at fault, but then they also look at, why aren't our neighbors, um, and our regional friends, Vietnam and India, why aren't they doing more in the Security Council to make, why are they why are they hedging also? So I think that increasingly it's going to become, the pressure in the Security Council is going to continue to build. India does have an important role to play, including by differentiating themselves from China in this, and standing with people who are trying to build a more democratic, plural, accepting kind of form of government, and a more resilient state in Burma, because that's really, when it comes to the threat to India's direct interests in Myanmar, it's largely from the insurgent groups that you mentioned, whose leaders are based in China, as you noted. But there's been this imperative to cooperate with the security forces, but as the security forces' control of that part of the country becomes more weak and attenuated, there's going to be other voices that India is going to have to engage with, including the ethnic groups whose territory the arms and the information transverses to get to India. So if you, it's in India's interest to take a more, to look at the situation a little bit less narrowly. Also, one of the groups within Burma that has historically been discriminated against by the military is the Indo-Burman population. They have second-class citizenship within Burma and are treated as foreigners, no matter how long they've lived there. Even people who lived there before the British colonial, who came in during the British colonial times, from India, who when Burma was part of British India, they still don't have full citizenship in many cases, and live very marginal lives in Burma. So there is a legitimate reason for India to be more forward leaning when it comes to Burma. Several, in fact.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned about India's standpoint being really decisive, and I think I completely agree with you there. I think we have moved towards the last 12 minutes of our discussion, and I just want to get back to the feminist issues and more about the policies of the US, etc. So advancing the rights of women and girls globally has been and continues to be an integral part of the US foreign policy. And access to sexual and reproductive health and rights for women is a trending discussion around the world, especially in the wake of the pandemic. And I personally adhere to it a lot. In the US, too, period inequity has been a major concern. This is my favorite question, actually, with currently there being 30 tampon taxing states and a legislation barring menstruators to carry menstrual necessities to the bar exam. Do you think a class action settlement would be approved? I want to understand, how do you see the way forward in this context?
Well, it's not an issue that I have actually domestically followed very closely. I know that in developing countries, it's an area where we've worked a lot to try to support, whether it's girls being able to go to school during their menstruation periods, or making access to menstrual supplies available. In fact, in Tibet, there's a small project that we supported that helped to create locally, to create products that were totally disposable, because the products that were available were not compostable. And when you're out on the Tibetan plateau and there's nowhere to dispose of your menstrual supplies, you need something that's completely biodegradable and compostable and will not harm the fragile environment. So one of our partners, one of our NGO partners, actually worked on a project to do that. So it's definitely an issue in the United States. I think that we have a lot of we do tend to solve things through litigious means. It may not always be the best way. I would prefer to see, I'm a big fan of forcing changes in the law to try to get legislators to be aware of this. And I think as we see more women in politics, more women getting elected to office, which has been a huge, we've seen huge jumps in that in the past few years, that these issues will become more salient and will get more traction in state legislatures where they're a problem. And so I think that's going to be the key to changing the mentality. And also, we've seen a lot of changes in terms of the willingness and capabilities of women to talk openly about period equality and about what it means, and how, and that it's not something that we should talk about like this, but that we can talk about it. It's a natural part of our lives, and it's important. It's the essence of who we are in many ways. And so I think that there has been a lot more openness, and that also will lead to changes. It's, sometimes the law is a lagging indicator. of what society is doing, and sometimes it's a leading indicator. Right now, the law remains a lagging indicator when it comes to some of these things, and so we just need to keep pushing to speed it up.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned about more women being present at the decision-making table, and I think that's a very important factor at play there. And I think moving on from there, participation of women in national parliaments across the world is only about 25%, although, like you rightly mentioned, it has seen leaps and bounds in the past few decades. But the male-female sex ratio is close to 50%, meaning that half of the world population is underrepresented represented in the decision-making process. At the same time, we have assessments that claim that female leadership has been able to handle the pandemic better. For example, we have Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese president, and Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and several other female leaders who've kind of become examples and faces of female leadership wins. So what do you think when we place these two things into context? Are there hindrances or are there hopes for the future being quote unquote female?
Well, I believe that I am a huge supporter of women running for office at all levels. And this is something that I have worked on both here in the United States as well as in other countries. When I worked for the International Republican Institute, it was my absolute, joy to be able to work in countries and new democracies to help them bake it in at the beginning, because that's where you start to the inequality doesn't just stay on a plateau. It tends to do like that, diverge, whatever. Right. But so you want to try to build it in at the beginning. Obviously, we've had the vote, women have had the vote in the United States for 100 years. And we just celebrated the 19th Amendment's passage last year. And it was a very important time for us to reflect upon both the progress we've made and how far we still have to go in terms of making sure, because even in the United States, we're just at about 26% of our elected representatives being women. And that's a big, that's a 5% jump. But every little bit, it takes so much work to move the needle. Every percentage is just such a challenging effort. So it's going to continue to be a generational project, but I think that as we see, we just have to keep filling the pipeline with more and more women at the local level, getting more women elected, getting more women to be comfortable. One of the biggest challenges I think we see is that women, when they are in the public space, face a different kind of, men get criticized for their policies and their decisions. Women get criticized for those things, as well as what they look like, things they've done in their past, their decisions about children, marriage, all of those things. They face a much different, and then they get called, different kinds of names as well online, and it can be very discouraging. And if you're a woman and you're like, do I really want to put my family through that? Do I really want to put myself through that? It can be very difficult. And, I worked for Nikki Haley, who is a great, she's a friend, and a role model, but she's also a politician. And she had to go through some really nasty stuff as an Indian American growing up in the South, not fitting in and facing a lot of discrimination and prejudice from all sides. It was, and talking to her about what it's like to run for office in that very difficult environment. But she also shows you can be successful if you work at it, and if you are, that it is possible. And so I do have a sense of possibility and have a great sense of positive energy about this, because I see women making great gains, including I noticed that when in the last elections for Congress, almost all of the new seats that the Republicans won were won by women, including women of color. And so I think, things are changing, not fast enough for sure, but you always want to be impatient with this kind of change. You always want to see it move faster, but it's important to not get discouraged and to keep pushing.
I completely agree with you there. And since we've reached the last 4 minutes of our conversation, this will be my closing question to you. And it's very much related to our last question. So we've seen that since the world is facing multiple crises, including the pandemic, of course, leadership based on empathy and resilience and sensitive recognition of gender, racial, and caste class differences have become more important now than ever. So how do you reimagine the feminist geopolitics unfold in a post-pandemic world? And who can play a pivotal role in reshaping the current scenario, according to you?
Well, I think that it's something that we all have a responsibility for, and that we have to do at every level, whether it's in academia or business, and I see some of the greatest women leaders in the world coming out of the business community and coming out of, non-traditional fields. You want to see women coming from as broad of a range of fields as possible, including coming out of the armed forces and taking up leadership positions. And I'm very I was really inspired by many of the women who've been selected to serve in the current administration at senior levels. I think there's some really amazing, diverse, and I mean diverse in their experiences, not just in their racial and ethnic makeup, but that you have really interesting women coming into their own right now, and who are driving these conversations forward about what leadership means and what it means to be a leader. At the same time, I think there is still always going to be a hunger for that kind of strong, tough guy leadership. And I don't think women should try to, emulate that. I think we have to be ourselves, and we have to, recognize that our kind of leadership is strong too, and even when it's not rough and tough, that it's as strong, and get people to understand that there is strength in empathy, that there is strength in listening to others, and hearing their viewpoints, and I think that's where we're moving, I hope. I That's the world I want to live in, and where we're all respectful of one another and treating one another with dignity, and not making assumptions, and prescribing the worst motives to one another. I think those are the things that I hope I would like all leaders to display those qualities, not just our women leaders, but to have all of our leadership display those qualities.
I agree with you, and I hope the same. And I'm so grateful to you for joining us today and giving us your time, and for this rich conversation that we just had. And I hope that perhaps in future as well, we can have more chances of such conversations with you around different issues, be it feminist geopolitics or foreign policy and so on. So thank you so much, ma'am, for your time today.
Thank you, Shalini. It was a pleasure talking to you. Have
Have
a
a
great
good
day.
day.